So without further ado, I'll hand over to our speaker for this afternoon, or for this evening, Joris, who's going to talk on the subject of are electric vehicles as green as we think?
Can everyone hear me? Yes. Fantastic, what a start. So hello everyone, my name is Joris, and today I'll be discussing on a pretty clickbaity title. So first of all, I'm really excited because this is officially the most people I have ever spoken to, but also pretty terrified as well, to be honest. So let's give myself a little bit of a personality. So, my name is Joris. I am a second-year PhD student at the AAPS CDT, or the Advanced Automotive Propulsion Systems Center of Doctoral Training. Basically, we study PhDs in cars. That's with the University of Bath. So, in terms of my skill set, I am mostly a life cycle assessment analyst, specifically in the circular economy, although I do have a generalist background in energy and sustainable development. I am not an engineer, but I do work with engineers. And despite me being in automotive, I don't have a driving license, which I compensate for my cycling. Most sustainable form of transport, in my opinion. And I have worked with many organizations in both industry and academically, which I'll be happy to talk about sometime afterwards. So, green, big buzzword. What does it actually mean in this context? Essentially, out of all the different sustainability aspects, I'll be discussing the environmental sustainability or the planet aspects of automotive, but I'll slightly delve into some social and economic aspects as well. And there's multiple automotive technologies that I could talk about, but I will say for this talk, I will be focused on battery electric vehicles because that is within my scope, although I will compare them to some other powertrains that we have as well. So the aim of this talk is really to provoke more complex thinking in sustainability rather than thinking about things in a linear fashion. We'll go over a heavily oversimplified history of how we got here with electric vehicles. We'll talk about the environmental frequently asked questions surrounding surrounding electric vehicles, before getting a bit more technical with life cycle assessment for how we actually measure environmental impacts and some evidence we have for electric vehicles. So, let's kick off with a oversimplified history. So most of us here can agree that the Industrial Revolution was incredibly important in mechanizing society, specifically through the invention of the engine, not only for our production systems, but also for personal mobility. It wasn't affordable to everyone, so then came along Henry Ford, who said, I wanted all my workers to have a car and be able to afford that. So with the invention of the assembly line process, they were able to bring production costs down to make not electric vehicles, not yet, internal combustion engine vehicles available to everyone. So things were going so great until our cities started to look something like this, with a lot of air pollution and a lot of smog. And essentially, critical studies were coming out that were linking air pollution to excess mortality across all of our cities. So we needed to do something about this. So lots of Clean Air Acts were introduced everywhere. For automotive, this meant that the tailpipe emissions got regulated. The fuels also got regulated to remove particles that can cause air pollution as well. So surely now things were going great. And it's not as if there's something else in the horizon like fossil fuels that could be a bit of a problem. And yep, you guessed it. Oil, fossil fuels was becoming a problem, specifically for the kind of popular media oil spills happening all across the world. One example is in Kuwait, where in the Gulf War, essentially through the conflict, lots of oil wells got essentially set on fire, spilled a little bit of oil, and for some of those days was responsible for 2% of global CO2 emissions just from those oil wells, to give you the scale of this. So all these geopolitical issues with oil was a problem, specifically for the economy, with fluctuations in essentially the price of oil, which is wreaking havoc. It was also getting a little bit warmer. It was getting warmer, and actually the planet was getting pretty hot as well. So we also had now the problem of greenhouse gases. But it's okay. We had the Kyoto Protocol that rallied multiple nations together to tackle climate change. We had technology come out, such as the first hybrid electric vehicles, to try to limit these greenhouse gas emissions. And then we had the really big Paris Agreement to really reinforce national action to limit climate change. You know where this is going. Things are going really great. So nations were committed to limiting greenhouse gas emissions. However, big corporations, such as ExxonMobil, knew about climate change a really long time. And they loved that they knew about it, because it wasn't really so good for them. So they hid it for a really long time, and even funded climate denial groups to delay the inevitable. People in automotive here might recognize this, the Dieselgate scandal, where Volkswagen were essentially saying their vehicles ran on clean diesel and had low emissions, but actually they were installing cheating devices to get past these regulations, and the air pollution was actually really a lot more toxic than first thought. So we are also living in the greenwashing era, which wasn't too good. So the culmination of all of these factors led to, for example, the EU to really bring the hammer fist, specifically on limiting tailpipe regulations, tailpipe emissions as much as possible. And over time, we saw the CO2 emissions from vehicles come down per kilometer. Combustion even got really political. As we know, from 2030, multiple regions in the EU are going to ban combustion engine vehicles. So we're seeing the market share of combustion engine vehicles, at least in the EU, to come down, and electric vehicles is going up. So we're going to eliminate all tailpipe emissions. We're going to eliminate all fossil fuels. So things are going very great. So following this trend, now we talk about electric vehicles. So one of the biggest drivers, of course, is greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. In transport in the EU, greenhouse gas emissions contribute to 26% of them. Most of these are caused from road transport, not aviation, coming from tailpipe emissions when you combust the fossil fuel, and the dependency on fossil fuels in the road transport sector has made it to be considered one of the most hardest to decarbonize centers as well. So in the EU, in 2019, we introduced the European Green Deal, which was essentially the EU's major response to climate change, where they said by 2030, we want to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 55%. By 2050, we want to reach net zero. And there are 9 different action routes introduced across different sectors. For transport, this was the Sustainable Mobility Strategy, where essentially they said, yep, we do have to reduce dependency on fossil fuels and have zero emissions from any new cars from 2035 through the use of these zero and low emission vehicles, with the primary strategy being these electric vehicles. So let's take a look at these clean green electric vehicles that have zero emissions. So essentially, the basics of why they are different from normal vehicles that we use. We have a big battery pack that will store electrical energy, an electric motor that will propel the vehicle, power electronics to manage this whole system, and then you simply plug in the vehicle, charge it from the grid, so you're not using any fossil fuels, and there's no tailpipe emissions, which is how we arrive at the term zero-emission vehicles. So what has actually been the whole fuss surrounding them in media and wherever we essentially talk about them? I don't see any problems. And essentially, we have to apply a different type of thinking, which I like to call life cycle thinking. So we have the energy conversion step, where in a combustion engine vehicle, you combust the fuel to propel the vehicle forwards. That has very clear and very visible CO2 emissions that are quite easy to regulate. But if you travel upstream for the fuel, it had to be distributed from somewhere, it had to be produced somewhere, raw materials had to be extracted somewhere. All these different upstream stages will also have some sort of emissions happening. But these are quite difficult to attribute to the vehicle, so they're not regulated specifically for the vehicles in this case. And this is often called the well-to-wheels life cycle of the vehicle. But then we have to consider the vehicle itself, the equipment, where material would have had to be produced, equipment would have had to be manufactured, and then something happens at the end of life. All these different stages also have CO2 emissions, which again are not regulated. So when you put an electric vehicle in it, and we're only looking at the energy conversion step, well, of course it's going to be zero emissions, because its CO2 is concentrating in all the other aspects. So it's incredibly important for us to investigate the whole supply chain, upstream and downstream. So here I come to talking about some of the frequently asked questions on the environmental impacts of the different life cycle stages in an electric vehicle. Start off with the raw materials, and I'll start off with the base question for how bad are the batteries for the environment? So in the battery pack, it introduces large amounts of different materials to combustion engine vehicles, specifically copper, nickel, cobalt, and lithium. Now, nickel and copper are mined usually together with cobalt, so I will talk about cobalt, assuming that I'm talking about nickel and copper as well. So let's look at lithium. Is that scarce? Do we have enough? That has been a popular discussion whether it will be able to meet the future demands of electric vehicles. So, most of the lithium actually comes from Australia, but some comes from Chile, China, and Argentina, and is distributed among these regions. Based on some academic articles, they do find with their modeling of supply and demand of lithium, that essentially up to 2035, we should have enough high-grade lithium, but after 2035 and beyond 2050, we will still have enough lithium, but it will have to come from lower-grade ores. Essentially, to simplify this, is we've got enough lithium, but as we go on, we'll need to mine it harder and process it more. Something maybe that's not talked about as much is the water problem of lithium. Based on one study where they tracked the water use of lithium through the battery supply chain, they find that in regions where lithium is mined, that places freshwater scarcity as a big problem for both humans and the local ecosystems. And based off the battery system that they analyzed, essentially it was a lot of water. So to put that in perspective, what these numbers mean is to produce 1 kilogram of battery, you need around a ton of water. The amount of lithium that is in that battery is around 50 grams. Now, to convert this a bit further, and some products, some water consumption details and some other products, this would put lithium carbonate, the mineral, at using 20,000 liters of water per whole kilogram, making it probably the most water-consuming product on the planet from other minerals, as well as agricultural products as well. But that is only one paper, so that could be a problem. And essentially, the lithium mines, they look very beautiful and very pretty. But essentially, why they use so much water is essentially it revolves on evaporation techniques to get the salts out. What about cobalt? Is that scarce? Do we have enough of that? Well, in this case, 60% of cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, because most of the world reserves are concentrated there. And it has been a problematic element. Historically, its price has fluctuated all over the place, and supply and demand has been quite difficult due to geopolitical problems in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And it's actually projected that after 2030, we might not be able to meet the demands of cobalt, as we actually might be running out of it. So we have maybe seen in popular media that many mining companies are now exploring deep-sea mining of cobalt, where essentially they have these big rocks at the bottom of the seabed that you can harvest and get cobalt from. But knowing our history with oil, this might not be the best idea to go down. It has also been a controversial element as well. Essentially, 75% of the whole cobalt supply chain and battery supply chain is actually controlled by China, which might lead to some geopolitical issues here we have in Europe. As well as up to 20% of cobalt mining comes from illegal artisanal mining activities with over 40,000 children employed in illegal labor, where we are seeing villages like this in Congo be transformed into this and looking something like this, with probably not some of the best health and safety and ethics standards here. In fact, based on some studies who have gone out to test the toxicity people might be experiencing in these mines, they have found that people here would have much higher levels of cobalt in their urine and blood that has been specifically pronounced in children. So that is quite a problematic issue we are experiencing in cobalt supply chains. So let's move on to the manufacture. One of the most common questions is isn't it a very energy-intensive process? Well, the simple answer is yes, without giving any numbers, but essentially the assembly process involves a lot of electricity being used, and we have to do a lot of drying with ovens that uses a lot of heat. Now, you could say that that could be made clean by renewable electricity and energy-efficient processes, such as Tesla's gigafactories and their army of solar panels. But let's remind ourselves that 75% of batteries are coming from China, which has a coal-dominated electricity mix, which has one of the highest carbon footprints. But that might be a bit difficult to say because some specific regions of China and the battery manufacturing plants might be located in hydro-based regions, which also has a really low carbon footprint, although it's quite difficult to regionalize this. So moving on to the use. So when we're using electric vehicles, are they cleaner? The simple answer is, well, yeah. We eliminate all the tailpipe emissions, which is great for cities and it's great for local ecosystems. However, recent research that is being done by Emissions Analytics finds that tire emissions and that particles from tire emissions might be quite toxic to local populations as well. And this might be a bit more problematic for the electric vehicle because it is heavier, it has more tire wear, which can lead to more tire emissions. Although we are quite uncertain on this, and this is quite new research that needs to be investigated. But also, when you plug in your EV, of course it doesn't have any tailpipe emissions, but you simply displace those emissions at wherever the electricity is being generated. Is that coal? Is it natural gas? Is it solar? Is it nuclear? These might vary regionally and might vary at the point in time that you're charging an electric vehicle. And all of these will have different emissions factors. So we're uncertain of what the carbon footprint of our EV use will actually be. So moving on to the end of life, what is going to happen with all the batteries? One of the most common questions I usually get. The answer is I don't really know, because a substantial amount of electric vehicles only entered the market in 2015. Older models of lithium-ion batteries will last maybe 8 years, but the newer models might last up to 20 years. So we haven't actually gotten to this stage where we have high volumes of batteries to do something with. Historically, it could be optimistic, because with lead-acid batteries, we have achieved 100% recycling rates. But the batteries we are going to have to deal with now are a bit more complex to process. Luckily, there are recycling routes that are being developed for this, and these can be categorized into 3 areas. One is pyrometallurgical recycling. That can be quite difficult to say, which is essentially a high-temperature process that is really scalable, where you can chuck in loads of batteries, smelt them, and essentially recover valuable materials. But it's quite energy-intensive, so it's not so good environmentally. Hydrometallurgical recycling uses chemical processes to extract materials at a finer level and higher recoverability, but it's quite difficult to scale that to multiple battery chemistries. With direct recycling, it uses no chemicals or heat, and it's based on physical processes that can recover essentially battery materials intact, which is really good, but this is the least scalable process that we have. But we do have options. And essentially all over Europe, these recycling methods, which do have high recyclability rates, are popping up all over Europe. So it looks like we are getting prepared for the potential mass waste of batteries in the future. However, we went straight to recycling. What about the application of some circular economy aspects, such as potentially reusing or remanufacturing the batteries? It has been found also that once batteries are spent in the electric vehicle, they still have some remaining energy capacity that could be used in lower demand applications, such as energy storage. But overall, this is quite uncertain, and it's mostly based on small pilot-scale examples, so it could be difficult to say what happens at the end of life. In the EU, we are doing something about this, notably through the Circular Economy Action Plan, where battery producers will need to have, for example, a minimum recycled content in their batteries. They will need to have transparency in the supply chains of how they got the materials and how are they going to sustainably source it. They will also have the carbon footprint in these batteries, which is also really good. and they will have extended producer responsibility where the consumer of the battery, after they're done with the battery, the producer of the battery will be responsible for collecting that battery and doing something with it at the end of life. And as well as promoting the remanufacturing and reuse supply chains as well. So, a lot of different stuff that's happening across the supply chain, so let's bring it together a little bit. So we know with electric vehicles, we increase the reliance of maybe some problematic raw material supply chains, which means we need to be thinking about designing out problematic materials, such as cobalt, out of our batteries. We need to build transparent and responsible supply chains to make sure we're not exacerbating inequalities elsewhere. And we need to go beyond climate change to say we need to start measuring and mitigating potential toxicity and water scarcity problems as well. Throughout the manufacture and use, we know that impacts here depend on the energy mixes or where we displace the emissions, as well as potentially hidden pollution that we don't know about coming from the tire emissions. So we need to regionalize electric vehicle production and use to be making use of renewable systems wherever possible. And we need to electrify heat that can be quite hard to decarbonize, as well as increasing energy efficiency of assembly line processes. And we need to think about measuring and mitigating tire emissions because we don't know much about it at this point and its potential severity to human health. At end of life, the management processes are pretty uncertain, but that also means we need to start scaling recycling infrastructure and logistics now. And we need to start thinking about designing for second life and remanufacturing to scale the circular economy. And on that note, establishing cross-sector partnerships to make sure that the automotive industry is collaborating with the energy storage industry to enable the circular economy routes as well. So, when we come back to the question if electric vehicles are as green as we think at this point, things are looking a little bit red. However, it's incredibly easy for me to stand here, pick out articles, and point out problems in anything, not just electric vehicles. But until you actually measure it relatively, how can you actually determine the severity of these problems? And when, how, and when do you know when to act on these problems? So this is where we come to talking about life cycle assessment, a way to actually quantify some of these problems. So, incredibly oversimplified history. In the 1960s, when we were having essentially problems, environmental problems all over the world, that yielded the first energy analysis methods to try and quantify some of these problems, which later led to life cycle assessment, with the first one being conducted by Coca-Cola. So there's your fun fact. But a lot of these LCAs, life cycle assessment, being done, were not really standardized. So it's only in the 2000s that we saw these methods to become unified and standardized to make sure everyone's carrying out life cycle assessment in a unified way. Essentially, the main standards are ISO 14040, which describes the principles and framework of life cycle assessment, and the other one is ISO 14044. Sounds like I'm giving my phone number. And that essentially sets out the specific requirements for like how to collect data and so on. These are the two standards. If you want to go into lifecycle assessment, you really want to remember, because all other standards that you might see or for kind of product labeling or communication of environmental impacts stem from those two top standards, which are essentially the fundamentals. So what do these standards actually say? Well, the very basics was this, that each LCA needs to be very clear about their aims and what they are going to do with their results. In the inventory, for how they should be collecting specific data. In the impact assessment, how do you transform that data into environmental impacts? The interpretation phase of what do the results actually mean, in addition to adding any other extra analysis, before doing something with the results. So in practice, what does this actually mean? So here's a little crash course. So say we want to understand the carbon footprint of some product X across its whole life. We're going to consider its raw materials, its manufacturing, its transportation, and its recycling in the supply chain. So this is where we would draw our system boundaries and say we're not considering anything else in a life cycle assessment to keep things simple. So this can be called a cradle-to-grave system boundaries. And the impact that we will analyze for carbon footprint is global warming potential. So when we come to the inventory, say we've collected all the data we need for our system, which is, for example, different greenhouse gas emissions that are happening. So you might think, okay, that's quite now simple to put into environmental impact somehow. However, for example, the raw materials might need some inputs coming from a third supplier that is not necessarily in our supply chain. That input, so to produce, say, a chemical that's being used in raw materials, has some type of emissions. And also before that, upstream the supply chain, it needs a precursor which also has some type of emissions. Okay, so the demand for a product has created some emissions upstream. And how do we actually attribute those input emissions to our product? So right now it looks like it could be quite simple. But then you consider the manufacturing step needs some electricity generated elsewhere which has emissions. That needs natural resources that has some emissions. Oops, it turns out that that same electricity generation supplies the chemical production step, which complicates things a little bit further. In the transportation, you need some packaging to be done, which has some emissions. Oh, it turns out also some of that same precursor supplies to the packaging production, which complicates things a little bit further. For the end of life, you may need some heat production happening, which also needs some natural gas produced, which has, again, emissions upstream. It also turns out that the heat production supplies the packaging production, and the natural gas is being used as a precursor for the precursor production. And to complicate things and make our job even harder, some of the recycled material goes back into the packaging production. So it was my job to confuse you? Absolutely. So essentially is how do we attribute the demand for a product or the emissions happening upstream? How many of these emissions are we causing? Luckily, we don't have to figure this out now. So essentially, this can be grouped into the background system. So whatever happens upstream or downstream. Well, we have derived a specific set of rules in the LCA community to follow how to attribute these emissions, and we have databases and software to solve it all for us. So then we can say there is a specific amount of CO2 coming from the background system. Okay, so we have our inventory data. What happens in the impact assessment step? So essentially, our impact is global warming potential, which is the amount of heat absorbed by specific gas that is standardized to be measured in kilograms of CO2 equivalents. Now, what does that mean? So essentially, we have some CO2 equivalents coming from the background system. We have some CO2 coming from the raw materials. But what about the other gases? How do we convert this into CO2 equivalents? Well, this is where we apply characterization factors, where other gases might have a greater global warming effect than CO2. So of course CO2 is going to be one, but something like HFCs, hydrofluorinated carbons, can have a much greater global warming potential. So we apply these characterization factors and get our emissions into CO2 equivalents. So we come to the interpretation step. We've collected this data, and let's try to analyze it. So we could do a simple contribution analysis to see what life cycle stages contribute most to these emissions. So from here, we could see that raw materials are pretty good, so we should maybe focus on mitigating impacts here, maybe for increasing efficiency or reducing emissions. We can see actually there's a lot of indirect emissions coming from the background system. And you might think those are quite difficult to decarbonize because we don't really contribute to those steps. But what we can do is, for example, source different materials from third suppliers. We can maybe switch energy providers and so on. We can also see transport could be a little bit problematic. So we could be reducing transport distances or electrifying our fleets. So this is definitely not an LCA training course, so please don't try this at home. But if you want to talk about LCA or how to get good at it afterwards, I'll be happy to help out that side of things. So let's come back to EVs and let's apply some life cycle assessment to some of the problems that we have been discussing. So I've selected 3 papers based on how recent they are and based on how, in my opinion, robust they are as studies. But there are hundreds of papers in the literature on this topic, so I would encourage you to maybe look at them afterwards. But let's go through some of them. So the first one is based on a Hong Kong case study that compares electric vehicles, internal combustion engine vehicles, and plug-in electric vehicles. So let's zoom in specifically into the production impacts in this LCA. So we see with the EV that it has a much bigger production impact compared with the one above, which is the internal combustion engine, coming from the pink purple bar, which is the lithium-ion battery. Now that same trend is seen, for example, in the fine particulate matter formation impact, again, from the battery. In human toxicity, again, the production impacts are much greater for the battery. And in mineral depletion, wow, that is quite a lot greater coming from the battery. Okay, so that's the production impacts. Let's look at purely the use phase impacts. So in this case, focusing just on global warming potential, where the bottom bars, the blue ones, are the internal combustion engine, and the green ones are the electric vehicle being used in different years. What do the different years mean? So they represent different electricity mix systems in Hong Kong. In 2019, it represents a fossil-based grid using natural gas and coal, whereas 2050, it's mostly a renewable energy at 85%, in 2050. So essentially here we can see that the EV being used in 2019, even with a fossil-based grid, still has lower use impacts compared to the internal combustion engine. We generally see something similar with fine particulate matter formation, although in 2019, the use of fossil grid still has quite high impacts because the coal is still air polluting. We see for toxicity, it's bigger and lower in some points, but this won't really matter once we combine the production impacts in a minute, and the same applies for mineral depletion. So we don't need to analyze this further. So let's combine the production and the use phases and see what happens. For the global warming potential, the EVs at the top versus the internal combustion engines at the bottom generally see that with renewable energy systems, they do become much lower in global warming potential. We see for air pollution, well, actually, initially, in the fossil-based system, in the EV HK 2019, it is a little bit higher because coal is still being used as the electricity generation source, which has some air pollution. But again, with renewable energy systems, the air pollution does become a lot better. For human toxicity, we now see the EVs at the top being much higher impact, again coming from the production phase. And same is seen in the mineral depletion, with EVs being much worse. Now that's a nice study, but it's a simple case based on Hong Kong. So we can look at a different study that looked at different electricity carbon mixes and its impact on the life cycle emissions of different powertrains. Where essentially in this case, the red line is the internal combustion engine vehicle. The purple one is the battery electric vehicle. And it applies for the other graphs, which are slightly different scenarios, which I won't go into too much. But essentially what we are seeing is when we increase the grid carbon intensity even up to 0.8 kilograms of CO2 per kilowatt hour generated, the EVs still end up doing better than the internal combustion engine, even in high carbon footprint electricity grid mixes. But what is interesting is we see these blue and green lines in high carbon mixes become actually better than the battery electric vehicle. And these are hybrid vehicles. So it turns out actually hybrid vehicles in high electricity carbon mixes might actually be better than battery electric vehicles. So maybe we shouldn't fully transition to that technology and still make the best of both worlds of internal combustion engine vehicles and battery electric. So let's look at some specific regions where this might happen. So if we look at France from another paper, which has a nuclear-based electricity mix, which is generally low carbon footprint, we can see that the electric vehicle does quite a lot better than the petrol-based hybrid electric vehicle. And then the right-hand side is the hybrid electric vehicle that uses synthetic fuels, which are essentially fuels produced by electricity. When we move to 2050, where potentially the grid will be 100% renewable, the EV still does really good, But in this case, what's quite interesting is a hybrid electric vehicle using synthetic fuels might actually even be a better option in this case. Now let's look at Poland, which in 2020 has a really high, well, today as well, its electricity is based on a lot of coal, which has a high carbon footprint. In this case, we see the electric vehicle is not maybe the best choice, but the hybrid electric vehicle still using petrol might be a better choice in this case. But we see a hybrid electric vehicle using synthetic fuels in a high carbon intensity grid has a quite whopping impact. And that's because these synthetic fuels have a lot of electricity demand to be produced. And then when we decarbonize the electricity system in 2050, we again see in this case that electric vehicles tend to do a bit better. So some general things that we can draw from this, even in fossil-based grids, EVs tend to do a bit better on air pollution categories, and in some cases will have lower life cycle greenhouse gas emissions by from 15 to 40% in some cases. With renewable electricity, we can remove up to 60% of these greenhouse gas emissions, although we do have the trade-off in toxicity and mineral scarcity. So the question really is that good enough to maybe achieve some of the environmental problems that we want to address? Well, coming back to some of the stuff we discussed in the Circular Economy Action Plan for responsive supply chains, increasing toxicity by 1,000% is probably not really aligned with that. And also from the European Green Deal, we want net greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Here we're only reducing them by 60%, which essentially we go from 10,000 tons or 10,000 kilograms of CO2 being emitted to 5,000 maybe, but that is still not good. So essentially, how can we achieve maybe net zero carbon emissions and address some of these problems? Essentially, for the use phase, we can decarbonize that completely with renewable electricity, but production, we can't really. So why is it that 100% in renewable electricity cannot decarbonize the whole battery supply chain production systems? And what could we do about some of the other impacts? And this is where I do a little bit of cell marketing for a paper that I've been working on and my research team. Well, what I have essentially been doing is future-based life cycle assessment of lithium-ion battery production and recycling. And there are some insights that I can draw from the work that I've been doing of how difficult it is to decarbonize production value chains for batteries. So in this simple case, I'll talk about only 3 batteries. One is an iron phosphate lithium-ion battery, which essentially the point of it is it removes critical materials, so that could be quite good. Then we have nickel manganese cobalt battery, which has historically been one of the main batteries used in the EV industry. And then we have a nickel cobalt aluminium battery, which uses less cobalt than other batteries usually, and is quite a high performance battery. So what do the production value chain results show? So for climate change, essentially all the batteries have relatively a similar carbon footprint. And we see that electricity throughout, this is the whole supply chain, contributes to around 50% of the climate change impacts, which is quite interesting. And actually quite a chunk comes from HFC emissions, fluorinated hydrocarbons, essentially coming from direct emissions that are not caused by electricity. A chunk of it comes from heat production, which again is quite hard to decarbonize with electricity. And some of these emissions are coming from direct emissions from mining, such as the use of fuels for big infrastructure. So from here, what we can see is one of the reasons renewable electricity can't fully decarbonize battery production chains is because it only can decarbonize 50% in this case. And we need to place more focus on the non-electricity greenhouse gas emissions, which we often maybe don't talk about, which is fluorinated hydrocarbons, heat, and activities from mining that really need decarbonization strategies to achieve net zero. When we look at human toxicity, we quite simply find that for all the batteries, one of the biggest contributors is sulfidic tailings, which are essentially coming purely from mining, which is land and water emissions of arsenic, selenium, lead and manganese, which are not too good, and are often linked to copper production as well. So here, quite simple, we validate the toxicity risks we have been talking about are concentrated in the mining activities mainly. For metal depletion, we do luckily see that the LFP, the iron-based battery, is doing quite a lot better, hopefully as expected. And all the batteries, copper is still a contributor in the metal depletion, but in this case, for nickel-based batteries, manganese is a bit more of a problem, and so is nickel. So the things we can capture for this is, interestingly, in these calculations, cobalt never showed up. I was quite surprised by this, but essentially it might be that the methods that we have for characterizing cobalt to metal depletion might not be there yet. But we do see that the iron-based chemistries, which eliminate critical materials, are doing so and are reducing the metal depletion categories, so actually removing these materials could be a good thing. So how about recycling? Could that be a potential strategy for mitigating some of these impacts? Well, in basic theory, if we produce something and use it and then recycle it, there will be some waste produced, but we will also maybe recover some material to put it back into production. For what it means for the net impact, it means it can potentially lower the environmental footprint of that. So applying some of these principles under only the best case recycling scenario, we find that for climate change, it could probably reduce the carbon footprints by maybe a third of the battery productions. For human toxicity, this might be up to nearly a half, which seems really good as well. And for metal depletion, especially for the batteries using critical materials, it could be up to 70%. So seemingly, recycling is a good strategy for some of these environmental impacts. So the best case scenarios look pretty good if we utilize recycling to recycle batteries in the future. However, there is something wrong with what I just said. This is flawed, because how we do LCA currently and how I did it in this case assumes that both production and recycling is happening in 2020. We know that the battery reaches the end of life maybe 10 or 20 years later in a future system. So we should probably be modeling that, right? So essentially, to describe this, essentially, we're going to assume we're producing the battery in 2020, and we're going to recycle it in 2030. So the initial case that we had is wrong, because we are not recovering the material, and we're not displacing the demand in the original production process, which had a high carbon footprint, to reduce its net footprint as well. What is actually happening is the recycled battery will displace material in a future production process, which might already have, hopefully, a lower environmental footprint as we decarbonize our systems in the future. This means the net impacts of our original process, the reductions aren't as big as we think. So to kind of show this on a bar chart based on some of the modeling that I have done of future systems, in comparison to the original scenario, where the battery is being produced in 2020 and recycled in 2020, if we now model that the battery is recycled in 2030 and displaces materials in a future system, we find that we have actually underestimated the original net impacts by 10%. And the impact is actually higher than originally thought, because we don't have as big recycling benefits as we actually think. Assuming to be recycled 20 years later, 2040, we are underestimating the impacts by maybe 20%, and so on. So really, this is to highlight that recycling could be a good strategy, but depending on how future systems evolve, they might not be as beneficial as we think. And it could be a quite misleading strategy, meaning we need to focus more on mitigating production impacts rather than trying to somehow offset these in a future system. It's a bit like planting a tree now, saying your net zero is zero carbon, but that tree hasn't grown yet into the future and you don't know what has happened to it. But that's not to stigmatize recycling. So to summarize from these insights, what can we actually do about the production impacts in essentially reducing the greenhouse gas emissions towards net zero? Well, renewable electricity will only get us halfway there. We need to consider achieving net zero through decarbonizing direct process emissions that are not electricity-based, decarbonizing heat, maybe through green hydrogen, and fuels such as synthetic fuels in specific mining processes. Recycling may be effective, but its benefits are quite uncertain, and we shouldn't really depend on this. And lastly, yes, we want to solve carbon emissions, but in solving it, we don't want to create disaster elsewhere. So we need to make sure we're accounting for other environmental impact, such as toxicity or resources. Okay, I have done so much talking. Essentially, I've talked about everything I know as a PhD student and some of the research I am doing, but there's a lot I haven't spoken about, and there's a lot of things I admit I don't know, and you might know even better. But let's try to answer this question: are electric vehicles as green as we think? Electric vehicles, as most things, are pretty grey, as it always has been. Nothing's actually been green. It's only in the recent years that we have the power to capture the complexity of these problems. We know the complexity goes deep into the supply chain that's interconnected, and that could only be solved by collective action. So sustainability is really hard because, again, there's so many interdependencies. And especially even gets harder when, okay, we want to be working with all actors in the supply chain to limit carbon emissions. But this gets more overwhelming and more complex when we want to consider other environmental impacts. How are we going to mitigate those? What kind of trade-offs will we actually allow? So that might be quite overwhelming, but it is my belief that we have also never been in a better position to address these environmental problems. Hopefully from this talk you have seen that we now actually have tools to use as a targeting system for complex environmental problems, so we can enable innovation in technology and policy to solve these problems. And most importantly, there is a new generation of people who are very ambitious and willing to act to secure a new future for us, and sustainability for the planet, the people, and achieving prosperity. So, thank you so much for listening to my talk. And if you have any questions that you want me to grill me on, I'd welcome those as well. Thank you.